What if the history you learned in school was only half of the story? We all know the tales of the Founding Fathers, the brave declarations, and the bloody battles that forged the United States. We see the polished monuments and hear the famous quotes. But behind these public acts and celebrated figures existed a hidden world of quiet meetings, secret handshakes, and solemn oaths. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a historical reality. The birth of America was not just a political and military event, it was also a social and philosophical revolution cultivated in private spaces. From the bustling port cities to the frontier towns, men were gathering in lodges and clubs, discussing radical new ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. These were the secret societies and fraternal orders of colonial America, and their influence is woven, often invisibly, into the very fabric of the nation. This video will explore America through a different lens, a lens focused on the power of hidden networks and shared ideals. By the end, you will understand that the founding of the United States was as much a product of these private brotherhoods as it was of public proclamations, and you may never see American history the same way again. The official narrative of America's founding is one of lofty ideals and open rebellion. We are taught about the Enlightenment thinkers, the tyranny of a distant king, and the courageous stand of patriots who believed in self-governance. This story is true, but it is incomplete. It misses the crucial machinery that turned philosophy into action and disconnected colonies into a unified force. How did ideas from European salons take root so effectively in the American colonies? How did men from rival regions like Virginia and Massachusetts learn to trust one another enough to join in a common cause? The answers to these questions lie not only in the halls of Congress, but also in the windowless meeting rooms of Masonic lodges, the shadowy gatherings of the Sons of Liberty, and the confidential letters exchanged by secret committees. These groups provided the structure and the trust necessary to execute a revolution. So what exactly was the role of these organizations? They served as incubators for revolutionary thought, safe from the watchful eyes of royal authorities. In an age of strict social hierarchy, they created unique spaces where a wealthy merchant, a skilled silversmith, and a country lawyer could meet as equals, bound by a shared ritual and a common purpose. They were the original social networks, facilitating the flow of information and building bonds of personal loyalty that transcended colonial borders. They provided a model for governance based on reason and elected leadership, a stark contrast to the divine right of kings. When we examine the symbols on the dollar bill, the closed-door debates of the Constitutional Convention, and the covert operations that defined the early resistance, we see the fingerprints of these societies everywhere. Their story is the hidden undercurrent of the American experiment. To understand their full impact, we must look beyond the famous names and into their private affiliations and actions. Figures like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were not just statesmen. They were active and dedicated members of these fraternal networks. They used the connections and principles forged in their lodges to advance the cause of independence. The story of America's founding is, in a very real sense, also their story. It is a story of how hidden hands built a visible nation, how secret oaths supported a public pledge of lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. We are about to pull back the curtain on this fascinating and often overlooked dimension of American history. The journey begins with the arrival of a particular fraternity from across the Atlantic, one that would provide a foundational template for the new nation's ideals and its most prominent leaders. Before we continue, make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. 1733. The Masonic Foundation. The story of organized secret societies in America truly begins in the early 18th century, not with a revolution, but with the establishment of a fellowship dedicated to moral improvement and intellectual discovery. Freemasonry, with its roots in the stonemason guilds of the Middle Ages, had transformed in Britain into a speculative society focused on Enlightenment values. It was this new form of Freemasonry that crossed the Atlantic, finding fertile ground in the American colonies. The first recognized Masonic lodge was established in Philadelphia in the year 1730, but it was the founding of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts in 1733 that truly signaled the start of a new social force. This was not a political movement, at least not at first. It was a fraternity, a collection of men drawn together by a shared curiosity and a desire for self-betterment in a world that was beginning to question old certainties. Who were these early Masons? They were often the ambitious and rising men of colonial society, artisans, merchants, doctors, and lawyers. They were men who looked at the world and saw not a fixed order dictated by birth, but a universe governed by natural laws that could be understood through reason. The lodge offered them something unique, a sanctuary from the rigid class structures of colonial life. Inside the lodge room, a man was judged not by his wealth or family name, but by his character and his commitment to the lodge's principles. The rituals they performed, often involving the symbolic tools of the stonemason, the compass, the square, and the level, were lessons in ethics. The compass taught them to circumscribe their desires and keep their passions within due bounds. The square reminded them to act with honesty and integrity toward others. The level symbolized equality, the idea that all men, from the highest to the lowest, were on the same level in the eyes of the great architect of the universe. The ideas circulating within these lodges were nothing short of revolutionary for their time. The core tenets of Freemasonry, liberty, equality, fraternity, and the pursuit of knowledge, were direct challenges to the authoritarian monarchy and state-sponsored religion of the 18th century. In a world ruled by kings who claimed their authority from God, Masons were building a society based on voluntary association and elected leadership. Their meetings were exercises in democracy in miniature, where officers were chosen by vote and matters were decided through debate and majority rule. This was a radical practice for men who lived under a distant monarch. Furthermore, the Masonic emphasis on religious tolerance was profoundly influential. To be a Mason, a man simply needed to believe in a supreme being. His specific denomination was irrelevant. This created a forum where Anglicans, Congregationalists, Quakers, and Deists could sit together as brothers, a powerful model for the future separation of church and state. The physical lodge itself became a crucial hub for the dissemination of these Enlightenment ideas. At a time when books were expensive and information traveled slowly, the lodge library was often a key repository of knowledge. Members would hear lectures on philosophy, science, and architecture. They engaged in debates and discussions that sharpened their intellectual abilities and broadened their horizons beyond the parochial concerns of their daily lives. This was not merely a social club, it was an unofficial university for the emerging American leadership class. The connections made there were not just personal, they were intellectual and ideological. Men left these meetings not only as brothers in a fraternity, but as advocates for a new way of thinking about society, governance, and the rights of man. They were, in effect, building the mental framework for a nation that did not yet exist. Therefore, by the mid-18th century, long before the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, a quiet revolution was already underway in the Masonic lodges of America. These institutions were subtly preparing the ground for political upheaval by nurturing the very ideals that would justify independence. They provided a structured environment where the abstract concepts of the Enlightenment could be experienced directly through ritual and fellowship. The lodge was a place where a man could practice being a citizen of a free republic before such a thing was even conceivable. The stage was being set, the key players were being educated and connected, and the philosophical foundation for a great experiment in self-government was being laid, one meeting at a time. The ideals of reason, liberty, and equality were no longer just words in a book. They were living principles practiced in secret, soon to be proclaimed to the world, more than a lodge. To understand why Freemasonry became such a powerful force in revolutionary America, we must look beyond its secret rituals and explore the profound appeal of its core tenets. What was it about this fraternity that captivated the minds of men like Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, and eventually George Washington? The answer lies in a powerful package of ideas that, when combined, presented a comprehensive challenge to the old world order. At its heart, Freemasonry championed reason over blind faith, liberty over tyranny, equality over inherited privilege, and self-improvement over static social position. In the context of the 18th century, this collection of principles was not just philosophical, it was genuinely revolutionary. It offered a new blueprint for human society, one that empowered the individual and celebrated his potential to build a better world through knowledge and virtuous action. Consider the principle of equality, symbolized by the common Masonic tool, the level. In the outside world, a man's status was determined by the accident of his birth. A lord was a lord, and a tradesman was a tradesman, and never the twain shall meet as peers. But inside the lodge, these artificial distinctions were stripped away. The Masonic constitution of the era explicitly stated that Masons were to be as brethren upon the same level. This did not mean that all men were the same in wealth or talent, but that they were of equal value and deserving of equal respect within the brotherhood. For a colonist who was constantly reminded of his subordinate status to the British Crown and its appointed aristocracy, this experience of fundamental equality was transformative. It fostered a sense of self-worth and personal agency that was essential for the development of a revolutionary mindset. How could a man who was treated as a brother in his lodge accept being treated as a subject in his own country? Then there was the relentless focus on reason and the pursuit of light, which was the Masonic term for knowledge and enlightenment. The lodges functioned as intellectual workshops where members were encouraged to study the liberal arts and sciences. This was perfectly aligned with the broader Enlightenment project, which sought to use human reason to understand and improve the natural and social world. Figures like John Locke and Isaac Newton were celebrated as heroes, and their ideas were discussed and debated. This created a culture that was inherently skeptical of tradition and authority that could not be justified by reason. When the British Parliament began passing laws that the colonists found unreasonable, taxes without representation, the quartering of soldiers, the revocation of charters, they were evaluating these actions through a lens sharpened in their lodges. The logic of independence made perfect sense to men trained to seek rational explanations for all things. The Masonic commitment to liberty and fraternity provided the social glue for a nascent nation. Liberty was not just a political concept, but a personal one, the freedom to think for oneself and to follow one's conscience. Fraternity was the practice of mutual support and unwavering loyalty among members. This combination was incredibly powerful. It meant that the drive for individual freedom was balanced by a deep sense of responsibility to one's brothers. This model of a society bound by voluntary commitment rather than forced obedience was a direct challenge to the top-down, hierarchical model of the British Empire. It demonstrated that order and stability could be achieved through mutual agreement and shared principles, not just through the threat of force from a monarch. The lodge was a living, functioning example of a social contract. Therefore, Freemasonry was far more than a simple social club or a peculiar society with strange handshakes. It was a complete system for personal and social development that ran counter to the prevailing winds of the 18th century. It took the abstract philosophies of the Enlightenment and codified them into a lived experience. It provided a moral and intellectual framework that empowered individuals, fostered a deep-seated belief in human equality, and championed the power of reason. When the political crisis with Great Britain intensified, the colonists who were Masons did not have to search for a philosophy to justify their resistance. They were already living it. They had been part of a voluntary self-governing community for years, and they were prepared to extend those principles to the governance of an entire nation. The lodge had not just taught them what to think, but more importantly, how to think as free men. 1776. The symbols of a new nation. In the year 1776, as the United States declared its independence, the new nation faced a monumental task. It needed to create its own identity, distinct from Great Britain. This identity needed visual symbols, emblems that could capture the essence of the American experiment and be recognized on the world stage. It is here that we find one of the most intriguing and lasting connections between the secret world of Freemasonry and the public face of the American Republic. Look at the Great Seal of the United States, first commissioned by the Continental Congress in 1776 and finalized in 1782. Its imagery is strikingly familiar to any student of Masonic symbolism. The all-seeing eye of Providence, surrounded by a glory of light, placed atop an unfinished pyramid. These are icons that resonated deeply with the Masonic brothers who were so prominent in the founding generation. The all-seeing eye was not invented by the Freemasons. It has a long history in Christian and Renaissance art, representing the omniscience of God. However, it was adopted and prominently featured in Masonic ritual and art throughout the 18th century. In a Masonic context, it symbolized the great architect of the universe, whose watchful eye observes all our actions and thoughts, encouraging morality and virtue. When this symbol was placed on the reverse of the Great Seal, it carried a powerful message. The new nation was not under the watch of a king, but under the providence of a divine, rational creator. It signified that the American Republic was a moral undertaking, accountable to a higher law than any human monarch. This was a fundamentally Masonic conception of divinity, architectural, orderly, and deistic, rather than sectarian. Then there is the unfinished pyramid. In Freemasonry, the building of King Solomon's Temple is a central allegory for the moral and intellectual improvement of the individual. Each Mason is taught that he is a living stone, tasked with perfecting his own character to help build a better society, a symbolic spiritual temple. The work is never complete. It is a perpetual process of building. The unfinished pyramid on the Great Seal perfectly captures this sentiment. It represents the nascent United States as a work in progress, a nation that had been founded but was not yet perfected. The 13 courses of stone represent the 13 original states, individual parts contributing to a larger growing structure. The Latin motto below, Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages, echoes the Masonic desire to rebuild society on a new and more perfect foundation. Even the primary tools of Freemasonry, the compass and the square, find their echoes in early American iconography. While not on the Great Seal, these symbols appear frequently in early American art, architecture, and even on gravestones of the period. The compass, used to draw a circle, symbolizes the boundaries of morality and the ability to limit one's desires. The square, a tool for creating right angles, represents honesty, fairness, and squaring one's actions with virtue. These were not just tools for stonemasons, they were ethical guides. Their pervasive use in the new nation's visual culture suggests how deeply these Masonic values of reasoned morality and personal integrity had penetrated the American consciousness. They were the tools with which the new republic would be built, both literally and figuratively. Therefore, the symbols chosen to represent the United States were far from arbitrary. They were a carefully considered visual language that communicated the nation's core philosophical principles. The fact that these principles so closely aligned with those taught in Masonic lodges is a powerful testament to the society's influence. The designers of the Great Seal, including Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, were immersed in the Enlightenment and Masonic thought. They selected symbols that expressed their belief in a rational universe, a providential destiny, and a national project that was both monumental and eternally unfinished. These symbols told the world that America was not merely a rebellion, it was a new kind of human endeavor, built on reason, virtue, and the unwavering pursuit of a more perfect union. The hidden symbols of the lodge had become the public emblems of a nation. 1793. George Washington, the Masonic General. The image of George Washington is fixed in the American mind as the stoic general and the first president, a man of almost mythical virtue. But to understand the man himself and the source of some of that virtue, we must look at his deep and lifelong connection to Freemasonry. Washington was initiated into the Masonic Lodge in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in the year 1752, when he was just 20 years old. For the next 45 years, he remained a dedicated and active member, seeing in the fraternity a reflection of his own beliefs about character, leadership, and civic duty. His involvement was not merely ceremonial, it was integral to his identity. Throughout the Revolutionary War, he consistently attended Masonic lodges, both military and civilian, and he used the principles of the craft to help build cohesion and morality within his officer corps and his army. One of the most powerful examples of Washington's Masonic faith in action occurred during the darkest days of the war, at the infamous winter encampment at Valley Forge. In the midst of incredible hardship, starvation, and desertion, Washington gave his personal approval and encouragement for his officers to form a military lodge, known as American Union Lodge. Why would a commanding general, burdened with the survival of his army, concern himself with a fraternal society? Because he understood that the lodge offered something his army desperately needed, a reinforcement of brotherhood and a reminder of the higher ideals for which they were fighting. Inside that lodge, officers from different colonies, who might otherwise be rivals, were reminded that they were brothers bound by a common obligation to support each other and the cause of liberty. It was a brilliant psychological and morale-building strategy rooted in his Masonic experience, the most public and symbolic fusion of Washington's Masonic identity with his role as the father of the country took place on September 18, 1793. The occasion was the laying of the cornerstone for the United States Capitol building in the new federal city of Washington, D.C. Dressed in a full Masonic apron, a gift from his Masonic brethren, and wielding a Masonic trowel, Washington presided over the ceremony in his capacity as master of the lodge conducting the event. This was not a casual gesture, it was a profound statement, written in ritual, about the foundations of the American Republic. The Capitol was to be the temple of American democracy, and its foundation was being laid not by a king but by a master mason, using the symbolic tools of architecture and brotherhood. It physically and spiritually connected the new government to the Masonic values of reason, order, and virtuous construction. Washington's own writings and speeches are filled with language that resonates deeply with Masonic teachings. He often referred to God as the great architect of the universe, a distinctly Masonic term. In his famous farewell address, he warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party, advocating instead for a unifying national brotherhood that mirrored the harmony of a well-governed lodge. He saw the United States itself as a kind of grand lodge, composed of individual states and citizens who, despite their differences, needed to work together to build a common future. His leadership style, based on elected authority, consultation, and a deep sense of personal responsibility, was a reflection of the governance he had practiced for decades within the fraternity. He led the nation as he had learned to lead a lodge, with dignity, fairness, and a commitment to the common good. In the end, George Washington was the ultimate embodiment of the Masonic ideal in American public life. He was the living proof that the principles taught in the lodges, virtue, brotherhood, and service, could be scaled up to guide an entire nation. His unwavering commitment to the fraternity, from his youth in Virginia to the pinnacle of his power, signaled to his contemporaries and to history that he believed these values were essential to the American character. The Masonic apron he wore at the Capitol ceremony is not a mere historical curiosity. It is a key to understanding his worldview. It tells us that for Washington, building a nation was the ultimate act of construction, requiring the same moral tools as building a temple or building one's own character. He was not just a general who happened to be a Mason. He was a Mason who became a general, and who applied the lessons of his lodge to the creation of a country. 1775. The military lodges. The American Revolution was not won by a professional army, but by a collection of militias and a hastily assembled continental force, led by officers who were often strangers to one another. Building unity and trust in this environment was one of General Washington's greatest challenges. A surprising and crucial tool in this effort was the proliferation of Masonic military lodges within the army. These were lodges that were attached not to a fixed town but to a particular military regiment, allowing them to travel with the troops. Their presence transformed the social dynamics of the officer corps, creating a web of fraternal loyalty that cut across regional and state lines. In an army where a Virginian might distrust a New Englander, the Masonic handshake and password became a universal currency of trust, instantly identifying a brother and a potential ally in a world of uncertainty. The function of these military lodges extended far beyond simple fellowship. They served as a vital sanctuary from the brutal hierarchy and harsh discipline of military life. Inside the lodge, a junior officer and a senior colonel could meet on the level, their military ranks left at the door. This was incredibly important for morale and for the open exchange of ideas. A young lieutenant with a valuable tactical suggestion might feel too intimidated to voice it in a formal military setting, but within the confidential space of the lodge he could speak freely to his brother officers. This informal communication network helped to surface talent, resolve disputes, and foster a sense of shared purpose that official military protocols alone could not achieve. The lodge became an engine of cohesion, binding the army's leadership together with bonds stronger than mere duty. The rituals of these lodges also took on a new, powerful meaning in the context of war. The Masonic themes of building and destruction, of life and death, were no longer abstract concepts, i.e., when Masons participated in rituals about the legend of Hiram Abiff, a master architect who chose death rather than betray his secret, the allegory of sacrifice for a greater cause resonated with profound immediacy. These men were, quite literally, risking their lives for the construction of a new nation. The lodge provided them with a philosophical framework to understand and endure the suffering and sacrifice of war. It offered solace, a reaffirmation of their values, and a reminder that their struggle was part of a larger, noble project of building a temple of liberty. Perhaps the most famous military lodge was the one attached to the 38th Foot, a British regiment stationed in Boston before the war. It was this very lodge, under the authority of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, that initiated Prince Hall and 14 other free black men on March 6, 1775, creating the foundation for African American Freemasonry. This single event highlights the transnational and transracial potential of the fraternity, even in an age of slavery and empire. Furthermore, the existence of Masonic brothers on both sides of the conflict sometimes led to remarkable acts of humanity on the battlefield. There are accounts of British and American officers recognizing each other as Masons during combat, resulting in the sparing of lives or the offering of more lenient terms of surrender. The brotherhood could, in rare instances, temper the brutal realities of civil war. The legacy of the military lodges is a testament to the power of fraternity in times of extreme duress. They provided a parallel structure of loyalty and support that was essential to holding the Continental Army together through its many trials. They helped to create a professional officer corps that thought of itself as American first and as Virginians or Pennsylvanians second. The trust forged in these lodges did not dissolve at the end of the war. It carried over into the peacetime efforts to build a new government. Many of the officers who had been brothers in arms and brothers in the lodge would go on to become framers of the Constitution, senators and judges. The invisible architecture of the military lodges had helped to build the visible foundation of the United States government, proving that the bonds of a secret society could be a powerful force in shaping the destiny of a nation. 1773, Military Lodge of the 38th Foot. The story of the Military Lodge of the 38th Foot offers a fascinating prelude to the Revolution and illustrates the complex ways in which Masonic networks operated across the British Empire. Before the war, Boston was an occupied city filled with British regiments sent to enforce the Crown's authority. Among them was the 38th Regiment of Foot, which held a travelling warrant from the Grand Lodge of Ireland for its regimental lodge. This lodge was a standard feature of British military life, providing a familiar social structure for officers and enlisted men far from home. but in the tense atmosphere of Boston in the early 1770s, this particular lodge would play an unexpectedly pivotal role, not for the British Empire, but for the cause of African American liberty and the creation of a parallel Masonic tradition that continues to this day. On March 6, 1775, just a month before the shots at Lexington and Concord, this British military lodge opened its doors to 15 free black men, led by a man named Prince Hall. Hall was a literate, skilled leatherworker and a prominent leader in Boston's free black community. His initiation, along with his companions, was a monumental event. In an era of pervasive slavery and racism, these men were granted the dignity of membership in a prestigious fraternity. They were made Masons in a legitimate lodge under a recognized Grand Lodge authority. This act demonstrated the universalist potential of Masonic ideals, even as the colonies themselves struggled to live up to them. For Prince Hall and his brethren, Masonry offered not just fellowship but a powerful tool for organizing and elevating their community. Why did the Lodge of the 38th Foot break with convention to initiate these men? The historical record is not entirely clear, but it likely involved a combination of factors. The Lodge's Irish charter may have been less restrictive on racial matters than some of its American counterparts. Furthermore, the Masonic ideal of universal brotherhood, however imperfectly practiced, provided a philosophical justification. Prince Hall himself was a respected and persuasive figure, and he may have had personal connections with members of the lodge. Whatever the specific reasons, the result was the creation of African Lodge No. 1. When the 38th Regiment was evacuated from Boston after the outbreak of war, this Black Lodge was left behind holding a permit to meet but lacking a full charter, which placed them in a precarious position within the Masonic world. Undeterred, Prince Hall and his brothers continued to meet and practice their Masonic rites. They saw in Freemasonry the same promise of liberty, equality, and self-improvement that their white counterparts did. For an oppressed community, the lodge provided a crucial space for developing leadership, practicing self-governance, and building mutual aid networks. It was a school for citizenship in a nation that denied them the full rights of citizens. In 1784, after being ignored by the white Masonic lodges in America, Prince Hall petitioned the Grand Lodge of England directly. His perseverance paid off, and the Grand Lodge of England issued a charter on September 29, 1784, creating African Lodge No. 459. This act made Prince Hall Freemasonry the first and oldest organized African-American institution in the United States. The founding of Prince Hall Freemasonry is a powerful story within the larger narrative of the American Revolution. It shows that the struggle for liberty was not a monolithic event, but a multi-layered one. While white colonists were fighting for their political liberty from Britain, Prince Hall and his brothers were using the same fraternal tools to fight for their social and civil liberty within America. Their lodge became a platform for abolitionist activity and the pursuit of civil rights for over a century. The creation of this brotherhood in arms within a British regiment, therefore, had consequences that echoed far beyond the battlefields of the Revolution. It planted a seed of freedom and organization within the African American community, proving that the ideals of the Enlightenment and Freemasonry could be claimed by anyone, regardless of race, and used as a foundation to build a more just and equitable world. 1765, the Sons of Liberty, a secret political army. As the Masonic lodges were nurturing the philosophical seeds of revolution, a more militant and politically focused secret society emerged in direct response to British policy, the Sons of Liberty. This was not a single unified organization, but a decentralized network of secret groups that sprang up in port cities up and down the coast, first coalescing in 1765 to oppose the hated Stamp Act. Unlike the Masons, the Sons of Liberty had no elaborate rituals or ancient traditions. Their purpose was immediate, political, and revolutionary. They were a secret political army, operating in the shadows to organize popular resistance, intimidate royal officials, and ensure that the British government's attempts to tax the colonies without representation would become unenforceable. They were the sharp, public edge of the growing discontent. The structure of the Sons of Liberty was deliberately cell-like and secretive to protect its members from arrest and prosecution. They often went by false names, or simply referred to themselves as the true Sons of Liberty. Their meetings were held in taverns, back rooms, and under the cover of darkness. To communicate and rally their supporters, they developed a powerful public symbol, the Liberty Tree. In Boston it was an elm tree. In other towns it might be a pole, which became known as a Liberty Pole. These objects became living altars to the cause. Notices would be posted on the tree, calling for meetings or announcing protests. To hang an effigy of a tax collector from the Liberty Tree was a powerful public spectacle, a clear signal that the authority of the Crown was being openly and symbolically challenged by a force it could not easily identify or control. The membership of the Sons of Liberty was a telling mix of social classes, reminiscent of the Masonic lodges but driven by a more urgent political purpose. Their ranks included skilled artisans like Paul Revere, a silversmith and mason, merchants like John Hancock, who had a financial interest in resisting British trade policies, and intellectuals like Dr. Joseph Warren, another prominent Mason. This alliance between the leather apron men, the mechanics and artisans, and the wealthy merchant class was crucial. It meant that the resistance had both popular street power and the financial resources to sustain a long campaign. The taverns where they met, like Boston's Green Dragon Tavern, which was also a meeting place for St. Andrew's Masonic Lodge, became the war rooms of the Revolution, where strategy was planned over pints of ale. The tactics of the Sons of Liberty were brilliantly effective and ranged from peaceful persuasion to outright violence. They were masters of propaganda, writing pamphlets and articles in newspapers to sway public opinion. They organized boycotts of British goods, which hit the mother country in its pocketbook, but they were also willing to use intimidation and force. Tax collectors were routinely threatened, and their property was often destroyed in a ritual known as tarring and feathering, a painful and humiliating punishment. The homes of royal officials were sometimes vandalized. The goal was not just to protest but to make the execution of British law impossible. They created a parallel authority in the colonies, one that answered not to the king's governor, but to the will of the people as interpreted by their secret committees. The rise of the Sons of Liberty marked a critical escalation in the conflict between Britain and its American colonies. They moved the debate from the theoretical halls of philosophy to the gritty streets of the ports. They demonstrated that a determined group of men operating in secret and willing to take direct action could paralyze the machinery of empire. They gave a name and a face to the resistance, turning a vague discontent into an organized movement. While the Freemasons had built the philosophical framework for revolution, the Sons of Liberty built the political and military machinery. They were the shock troops of liberty, and their success in nullifying the Stamp Act and other early measures proved to the colonists that they had the power to defy the most powerful empire on earth. Their actions set a precedent of resistance that would inevitably lead to a full-scale war for independence. 1772. From petitions to tar and feathers, the Sons of Liberty learned very quickly that polite petitions to Parliament were achieving nothing. As British policies became more oppressive, their tactics evolved in response, becoming more sophisticated, more coordinated, and more severe. They understood that to defeat a global empire, they needed to fight on multiple fronts. They needed to win the hearts and minds of the public. They needed to cripple the economic machinery of the Stamp Act and Townshend duties, and they needed to make the position of any royal enforcer so untenable that the entire British administration in the colonies would grind to a halt. This was not a disorganized mob. It was a calculated campaign of resistance that blended intelligence gathering, economic warfare, and psychological terror. They were pioneering a form of asymmetric warfare that would become a template for revolutions to come. One of their most powerful tools was the boycott. The Sons of Liberty organized non-importation agreements, which were colonial-wide pledges to stop purchasing British goods. To enforce these agreements, they had to become vigilantes. They published the names of merchants who violated the boycotts, subjecting them to public scorn and financial ruin. But they also patrolled the docks and warehouses, looking for smuggled goods or any cargo that violated their agreements. This required an extensive intelligence network. Sailors, dock workers, and shopkeepers acted as their eyes and ears, reporting any suspicious activity to the shadowy leadership. This demonstrated a remarkable level of organization and popular support. They were, in effect, creating a parallel government with its own laws and its own enforcement mechanisms, all operating in the open yet led by men whose identities were often a closely guarded secret. When persuasion and economic pressure were not enough, the Sons of Liberty turned to targeted intimidation. The most infamous example of this was the practice of tarring and feathering. This was not a mere prank, it was a brutal and painful form of mob punishment that could cause severe burns and lifelong scarring. A customs official or an informant would be seized, stripped to the waist and covered in hot tar and feathers. They would then be paraded through the town on a rail, often to the jeers of the very community they once policed. The message was unmistakable. If you work for the British Crown and enforce its unjust laws, you are an enemy of the people, and you will be treated as one. This psychological warfare was incredibly effective at discouraging colonists from taking jobs with the royal administration and forcing existing officials to resign in fear. A key event that showcases their audacity was the Gaspee affair in 1772. The HMS Gaspee was a British customs schooner that was notoriously aggressive in patrolling the waters of Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, harassing merchants and enforcing trade laws to the letter. In an act of stunning boldness, a group of prominent citizens from Providence, led by a man named John Brown, organized a raid. They rowed out to the ship, which had run aground, overwhelmed the crew, and set the vessel ablaze. This was not a random act of vandalism. It was a deliberate planned attack on a symbol of British authority. The British government was outraged and set up a royal commission to investigate, but not a single person was ever convicted. The community, bound by secrecy and a shared cause, closed ranks and protected the perpetrators. The legacy of this escalation in tactics is a complex one. The Sons of Liberty successfully made British rule unworkable through a combination of public persuasion and private violence. They proved that a dedicated minority, using guerrilla tactics and enjoying popular support, could stand up to a professional army and bureaucracy. However, their methods also raised a troubling question. Where is the line between justified resistance and mob rule? Their use of terror and destruction of property established a revolutionary precedent, but it also sowed the seeds for future vigilante justice and civil unrest. They were freedom fighters to some and terrorists to others, a duality that has surrounded revolutionary movements throughout history. They took the abstract desire for liberty and turned it into a dangerous, tangible, and often brutal reality, forcing every colonist to choose a side. 1773, the Boston Tea Party as a covert operation. The Boston Tea Party is often remembered as a rowdy protest where colonists, dressed as Native Americans, dumped tea into the harbor. But to view it as a simple act of vandalism is to miss the point entirely. It was in fact a brilliantly planned and executed covert military operation, one of the most successful in American history. The entire event, from initial intelligence to the final cleanup, was managed with a discipline and secrecy that would be the envy of any modern special forces unit. The men involved were not an anonymous mob. They were a hand-picked team, largely drawn from the overlapping memberships of the Sons of Liberty and the Masonic lodges of Boston, men who were already trained in secrecy, coordination, and following orders without question. The crisis began when the British government passed the Tea Act in 1773, granting the financially troubled East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. This was a clever political move by Parliament. It made tea cheaper, but it also included a tax, which the colonists saw as a subtle way to establish Parliament's right to tax them without consent. The Sons of Liberty recognized the threat immediately. They had to prevent the tea from being unloaded because if it landed, the tax would be paid, and their principle of no taxation without representation would be broken. Mass meetings were held, and the royal governor was petitioned to send the ships back to England. But when Governor Hutchinson refused, the leadership knew that direct action was the only option left. The planning for the operation was conducted in the utmost secrecy. The inner circle, which included known figures like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Dr. Joseph Warren, likely made the key strategic decision, but the operational details were handled by a smaller group. They met in private homes and in the back rooms of taverns, particularly the Green Dragon Tavern, which was also the meeting place for St. Andrew's Masonic Lodge. Many of the participants were indeed Freemasons, men accustomed to secret signals, coded language, and blindfolds. This training in confidentiality was invaluable. The date was set, the teams were organized, and the plan was rehearsed. Every man knew his role, from those who would board the ships to those who would stand guard on the docks to prevent interference. On the night of December 16th, 1773, a signal was given from the Old South Meeting House. A group of men, perhaps as many as 130, had gathered, their faces smeared with soot or disguised with makeshift mohawk costumes. This was not just for theatrical effect. It was a deliberate measure to conceal their identities from British spies and from each other, providing plausible deniability. They moved quietly to Griffin's Wharf, where 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were docked. In a display of remarkable efficiency, they divided into 3 teams, boarded the vessels simultaneously, and over the course of 3 hours methodically hoisted 342 chests of tea from the holds and broke them open with axes, dumping their contents into Boston Harbor. The entire operation was conducted with a disciplined silence. There was no looting, no damage to the ships themselves, and no violence against the crew. The aftermath of the Boston Tea Party proved the operation's ultimate success. The British response was the Intolerable Acts, a series of punitive laws designed to punish Massachusetts and bring it to heel. But instead of isolating Boston, these acts pushed the other colonies to its defense, leading directly to the calling of the First Continental Congress. The covert operation had achieved its strategic goal. It had unified the colonies against a common enemy. The participants, despite a massive manhunt, were never conclusively identified and brought to trial. Their secret had held. The Boston Tea Party stands as a masterclass in revolutionary action, a perfect blend of political theater and military precision, demonstrating how a small, secretive and determined group could change the course of history by turning a harbor into a teapot and an act of destruction into a symbol of defiance. 1773. The Committees of Correspondence, a secret communication network. While the Sons of Liberty were taking direct action in the streets, another, less dramatic but equally revolutionary secret network was being spun across the colonies. The Committees of Correspondence. Imagine a world without telegraph, telephone, or internet, where news traveled by horse and ship, taking weeks to move from Georgia to New Hampshire. In this world, political unity was nearly impossible. The British government could easily isolate and punish a single colony, assuming the others would not rally to its defense. The genius of the Committees of Correspondence was that they solved this problem of distance and disconnection. They created a shadow communication system, a nervous system for the revolutionary body that allowed for the rapid exchange of information, ideas, and strategy, effectively turning 13 separate colonies into a single coordinated resistance movement. The idea is largely credited to Samuel Adams in Boston, a man who understood the power of information as a weapon. In 1772, he proposed that Boston form a standing committee to communicate with other towns in Massachusetts and, crucially, with the other colonies. The purpose was to state the rights of the colonists, publicize the infringements of those rights by Great Britain, and request and share ideas for a unified response. Other colonies quickly followed suit. Virginia established its own committee in 1773 with members like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. Soon, a web of committees stretched from New Hampshire to South Carolina, each composed of leading patriots in their respective communities, creating a de facto underground government. The operation of these committees was a testament to their effectiveness. When a crucial event occurred, like the Boston Tea Party or the closing of Boston's port under the Intolerable Acts, the local committee would draft a letter, often using passionate and persuasive language. Riders on fast horses would then carry these letters along established post roads to the next committee, which would read it, copy it, and send it further along the chain. This system was far faster and more reliable than the official Royal Mail, and it was entirely controlled by the Patriots. It meant that a narrative of events from the Patriot perspective could reach every corner of the colonies before the Royal Governor's official report even reached London. They were winning the information war. The content of these letters was not just news, it was political philosophy and strategic coordination. They debated the nature of rights, the limits of parliamentary power, and the proper response to British aggression. When the First Continental Congress was convened in 1774, it was the Committees of Correspondence that managed the elections of delegates and communicated the Congress's decisions back to the people. They were the organizational backbone of the revolution, the practical mechanism that turned abstract grievances into a functional political union. The men who served on these committees were the same men who would later serve in state legislatures and the National Congress. They were training for self-government in real time. Therefore, the Committees of Correspondence were arguably the most important secret society of them all. They wielded no axes, carried no muskets, and applied no tar and feathers. Their weapon was information, and their victory was the creation of an American political consciousness. They forged a shared identity among the colonies, making them realize that their cause was common and their fate was intertwined. Without this network, the resistance likely would have remained a series of disconnected local protests, easily suppressed by the British military. With it, the colonies could act as one. They provided the essential infrastructure for revolution, proving that in the fight for freedom, a well-written letter carried by a determined rider and distributed by a secret committee could be as powerful as any weapon on the battlefield. 1786. The influence of the Illuminati on early America. No discussion of secret societies in early America is complete without confronting the most infamous and misunderstood of them all, the Illuminati. The very word conjures images of a shadowy, all-powerful cabal, pulling the strings of world events from the depths of a hidden lair. This popular conspiracy theory has been woven into the story of the American founding for centuries. But what is the historical truth? The real order of the Illuminati was founded on May 1st, 1776, in Bavaria by a university professor named Adam Weishaupt. Its goals were Enlightenment ideals taken to their most radical extreme. It opposed religious influence in public life, superstition, and the abuse of state power. It was, in essence, a secret society for the promotion of secular rationalism, and it was violently suppressed by the Bavarian government just a decade later, in 1786. So how did this short-lived German group become linked to the American Revolution? The connection is tenuous at best. There is no credible historical evidence that the Bavarian Illuminati ever established a chapter in America or directly influenced any of the founding fathers. The revolution was nearly over by the time the Illuminati was disbanded. The myth began to take hold in the 1790s, largely due to a series of sermons and pamphlets by New England clergymen, most notably Timothy Dwight and Jedediah Morse. These Federalist preachers were horrified by the radicalism of the French Revolution, which they saw as a godless, chaotic upheaval. They seized upon the writings of a Scottish professor named John Robison, who claimed without solid proof that the Illuminati had survived its suppression and masterminded the French Revolution as part of a plot to overthrow all governments and religions. This fear was then imported into American politics, becoming a weapon in the bitter partisan battles between the Federalists, led by John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. Federalist newspapers began to accuse Jefferson and his party of being under the influence of Illuminist principles. They pointed to Jefferson's deism, his friendship with French radicals, and his skeptical view of organized religion as proof of his secret allegiance. It was a classic smear campaign using the specter of a secret society to paint one's political opponents as un-American and dangerous. The fact that many of the Founding Fathers were Freemasons only added fuel to the fire, as conspiracy theorists conflated the two very different organizations, imagining a vast, interconnected network of subversion. The public reaction to this fear was the Anti-Masonic movement, which peaked in the 1820s and 30s. This was a genuine popular uprising against perceived secret influence, but it was directed almost entirely at Freemasonry, not the Illuminati. The disappearance and presumed murder of a former Mason named William Morgan in 1826, who had threatened to publish a book exposing Masonic secrets, ignited a firestorm of public outrage. This led to the formation of the Anti-Masonic Party, the first third party in American politics. The Illuminati scare, however, had laid the groundwork for this reaction by conditioning the public to believe that secret societies were a direct threat to the Republic. In the end, the historical influence of the Bavarian Illuminati on the American founding was precisely zero. Its lasting impact, however, was profound in a different way. It introduced into the American psyche a powerful and enduring template for conspiracy thinking. The Illuminati became a blank screen onto which people could project their fears about modernity, secularism, and political change. The fact that we still debate their role today is a testament to the power of a good story over historical fact. The real story of the Illuminati in America is not one of hidden control, but one of how fear and political rhetoric can create a phantom enemy, a lesson that remains deeply relevant in our own time. 1776. The Long Room Club. While the Masonic lodges provided a broad philosophical foundation, other more focused secret clubs were where the rubber of theory met the road of action. In Philadelphia, a city that would become the birthplace of American independence, there was a place known as the Long Room Club. It met above a bookstore, in a room attached to the shop of a printer named Robert Bell. This was no ordinary bookstore. It was a hub for the most radical and avant-garde literature of the day, a place where the works of Enlightenment thinkers from across Europe were readily available. The Long Room Club was, in effect, a private debating society for the city's most passionate and forward-thinking lawyers, merchants, and intellectuals. It was here that the abstract concept of American independence was first seriously discussed and planned by a core group of revolutionaries. The membership of this club reads like a who's who of the American founding. It included Thomas Jefferson, a young, brilliant, and somewhat reserved Virginian with a profound talent for writing. It included Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman and renowned scientist, who provided a wealth of political and scientific knowledge. It included John Adams, the fiery and principled lawyer from Massachusetts, and his cousin Samuel Adams, the master propagandist and political organizer. These men, and others like them, would gather in this long room, surrounded by books, to argue, strategize, and dream. The conversations that took place there were undoubtedly some of the most consequential in American history, as these men grappled with the audacious idea of breaking away from the most powerful empire on earth. What was discussed in the Long Room Club? Everything. They debated the legal and philosophical justifications for independence. They analyzed the latest news from London and from the other colonies, shared via the Committees of Correspondence. They discussed the writings of Locke and Montesquieu, applying their principles to the specific grievances of the colonies. But this was not merely an academic exercise. This was where the strategy for the Second Continental Congress was likely formulated. It was where the language and arguments for the Declaration of Independence were honed. Thomas Jefferson, tasked with drafting the document, was undoubtedly influenced by the debates and ideas that flourished in this private, book-lined space. The club was the intellectual workshop where independence was forged. The existence of clubs like the Long Room highlights a crucial point. The American Revolution was not a spontaneous uprising, but a carefully managed intellectual and political project. The success of the movement depended on these small, trusted circles where men could speak freely, without fear of their words being reported to royal authorities. The secrecy was essential. It allowed for the frank exchange of radical ideas and the development of a coherent, unified strategy. The trust built in these settings was what enabled men from different colonies, with different personalities and interests, to work together effectively in the public forum of the Continental Congress. The public declarations were made possible by the private deliberations. The Long Room Club, therefore, represents the nexus of ideas and action. It was a place where the Enlightenment was translated into a revolutionary program. The books on the shelves provided the theory, and the men in the room provided the will and the strategy to turn that theory into reality. It was in such unassuming places, above a bookstore in a tavern's back room within a Masonic lodge, that the American nation was truly born. The public documents and famous speeches were the final product, but the raw material was shaped and assembled in secret by a brotherhood of thinkers who dared to imagine a new world and then devise the plan to build it. 1778. Benjamin Franklin, the ultimate networker. If one man embodied the spirit of connection and the power of secret networks, it was Benjamin Franklin. His life was a masterclass in building and leveraging relationships for the betterment of himself, his community, and his nation. His involvement with Freemasonry began early, and he remained a devoted member throughout his long life, rising to become the Grand Master of Pennsylvania in 1734. But for Franklin, the lodge was more than a philosophical society. It was the center of a vast and ever-expanding web of contacts that stretched across the American colonies and, most importantly, across the Atlantic to the heart of Europe. He was the ultimate networker, and he would use this network to perform his greatest service to the American cause, securing the alliance with France. Franklin's Masonic membership gave him instant credibility and trust wherever he went in the civilized world. When he arrived in France in 1776 as a commissioner to the French court, he was not seen as a rustic colonial rebel, but as a world-renowned scientist and a brother Mason. Freemasonry was immensely popular among the French aristocracy and intellectuals. Franklin was welcomed into the most elite lodges in Paris, where he met and befriended influential figures like the Marquis de Lafayette, and crucially the French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes. In these settings, surrounded by brothers, he could make the American case for support in a friendly, confidential atmosphere. The lodge provided a back channel for diplomacy that bypassed the stiff formalities of the royal court. Franklin brilliantly cultivated his public image in France, playing the part of the wise, simple, fur-hatted philosopher from the New World. But behind this carefully constructed persona was a shrewd and calculating operator who understood the power of personal relationships. He attended lodge meetings regularly, gave speeches, and participated in rituals. He used these gatherings to build a powerful coalition of French supporters who became known as the Franklinists. This network provided not just diplomatic support, but also vital intelligence, funds, and volunteers for the American war effort. The flow of French guns, gunpowder, and money that kept the Continental Army afloat was, in no small part, a result of the trust and friendships Franklin built within the Masonic lodges of Paris. His work was not without significant personal risk. He was in his 70s, suffering from gout and other ailments, and he was technically an enemy agent in a foreign land. If the British had succeeded in capturing him, he would have been hanged for treason. Yet he persevered for nearly 9 years, tirelessly working his connections. His efforts culminated in the Treaty of Alliance in 1778, which formally brought France into the war on the American side. This was the turning point of the Revolution. The entry of the French Navy and Army forced the British to fight a global war, stretching their resources thin and ultimately leading to their defeat at Yorktown in 1781. Benjamin Franklin's story demonstrates the tangible, real-world power of fraternal networks. He could not have succeeded through official channels alone. It was the trust forged in the secret, solemn spaces of the Masonic Lodge that opened the doors to the French court. He turned philosophical brotherhood into a military alliance. He was proof that in the game of nations, who you know is often as important as what you know. Franklin used his vast web of connections, spun over a lifetime of fraternal association, to pull the strings that brought a king to the aid of a republic, ensuring that the American experiment would not die in its infancy. He was the revolution's secret weapon in Europe, and his lodge membership was his passport. 1775. Paul Revere, Masonic messenger. The name Paul Revere is synonymous with his famous midnight ride on April 18, 1775, to warn the Massachusetts countryside that the British regulars were marching to Concord. But the popular poem by Longfellow, while creating a national legend, obscures the deeper truth of who Revere was and how he operated. Paul Revere was not a lone rider acting on a sudden impulse. He was a key node in a sophisticated secret communication network, and his effectiveness was rooted in his membership in Boston's overlapping circles of revolutionaries and Freemasons. He was a trusted messenger because he was a known and sworn brother in a city teeming with spies and informants. Revere was a master silversmith by trade, but he was also a committed son of liberty and a member of St. Andrew's Masonic Lodge. This lodge included within its membership a who's who of Boston's patriot leadership, including Dr. Joseph Warren, John Hancock, and James Otis. His involvement in these groups meant he was already enmeshed in the secret planning and intelligence gathering that defined the pre-revolutionary period in Boston. He had previously been a rider for the Boston Committee of Correspondence, carrying secret messages to New York and Philadelphia. His ride on April 18th was not his first mission. It was the most famous iteration of a role he had been performing for years. He was the revolution's trusted courier. On the night of the ride, the system swung into action with precision. Dr. Joseph Warren, a fellow Mason and the leading patriot organizer in Boston after Samuel Adams and John Hancock had fled, received intelligence from his own secret sources that the British were moving on Concord, likely to seize the militia's powder stores and possibly to arrest Hancock and Adams. Warren summoned two riders he knew he could trust implicitly, Paul Revere and William Dawes. He chose them not just for their horsemanship but for their loyalty and their connections. Revere's first act was not to leap on his horse, but to arrange for two other brothers to hang two lanterns in the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea, a pre-arranged signal for the Patriots in Charlestown. This was a coordinated, multi-pronged operation. As Revere rode, he did not simply shout, "The British are coming." His mission was more targeted. He stopped at the homes of militia captains and other key figures along the route to Lexington and Concord, delivering his specific warning. Many of these men were also his Masonic brothers. The shared bond of the lodge meant that when Revere knocked on a door in the middle of the night, his message was received with immediate credibility and urgency. That trust was the difference between a message being acted upon and one being dismissed. The network activated and the militia began to assemble, setting the stage for the first armed conflict of the American Revolution the next morning at Lexington Green. Paul Revere's story, therefore, is far more compelling than the myth. He was not a solitary hero, but the most visible part of a hidden machine. His successful ride was the product of a well-organized secret society in action. It relied on trusted intelligence, pre-arranged signals, and a web of personal relationships built in places like the Green Dragon Tavern and St. Andrew's Lodge. The Midnight Ride was a covert military operation, and Paul Revere was its principal agent, a Masonic messenger whose knowledge of the landscape and, just as importantly of the people within it, helped to turn the tide of history on one April night. 1787, the Constitutional Convention, a secret of its own. In the summer of 1787, 55 men gathered in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia with a task that seemed nearly impossible: to fix the broken Articles of Confederation that governed the fledgling United States. Instead of amending the existing document, they made the radical decision to scrap it entirely and create a new constitution. What is astounding to the modern mind is that they did all of this in total secrecy. The doors and windows of the assembly room were shut tight, despite the oppressive heat, and sentries were posted outside. The delegates imposed upon themselves a vow of silence, agreeing to disclose nothing of their debates to the public or the press until their work was complete. This was a conscious decision to create a secret society for the purpose of founding a public government. Why did the framers choose to work in secret? They had learned a hard lesson from the Revolutionary period. The debates in the Continental Congress had often been conducted in public view, and the delegates were frequently subject to intense pressure from their home states, mob actions in the streets and vicious attacks in the partisan press. This made compromise, the essential ingredient for creating a lasting government, exceedingly difficult. James Madison, the convention's most prepared delegate, argued that secrecy was absolutely necessary to allow for free and frank debate. The delegates needed to be able to float ideas, change their minds, and make difficult compromises without having every word instantly broadcast and criticized. They needed a safe space to think. This decision proved to be one of the most wise of the entire convention. The secrecy allowed for a remarkable level of candor. Edmund Randolph of Virginia could propose a wildly radical new plan for a powerful national government without immediately causing an uproar back home. The small states could vehemently argue for equal representation without being accused of treason by their larger neighbors. Compromises like the famous Great Compromise that created a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate could be hammered out behind closed doors. If these contentious debates had been public, it is likely the convention would have fractured and failed. The secrecy was the blanket that allowed the delicate seedling of the Constitution to germinate without being exposed to the harsh elements of public passion. The practice of secrecy was, of course, second nature to many of the delegates. A significant number were Freemasons, well accustomed to private deliberations and binding oaths. George Washington, who presided over the convention with silent dignity, was the most prominent Mason in America. Benjamin Franklin, now 81 years old, was another. While we should not overstate the Masonic influence on the specific content of the Constitution, the practice of the convention, its closed doors, its rule of confidentiality, its reliance on reasoned debate free from outside influence, was entirely consistent with the Masonic Lodge model. They were applying the methods of a private fraternity to the most public of tasks, creating a government of, by, and for the people. The legacy of the convention's secrecy is a complex one. It was undoubtedly essential to its success. It allowed for the creation of a sophisticated and enduring framework of government that might never have been achieved in an open forum. However, it also established a precedent of government deliberation happening away from the people it serves. The tension between the need for confidential negotiation and the public's right to transparency is a debate that continues in American politics to this day. But in 1787, there was no other way. The secret of the Constitutional Convention was not a conspiracy against the people but a necessary protection for their future. It was the private crucible in which the public instrument of American government was forged. 1787. Masonic Principles in the Constitution. When the finished Constitution was presented to the American public, it contained no Masonic passwords or secret symbols. It was a practical, secular document outlining the structure of a new federal government. Yet for those familiar with the principles of Freemasonry and the Enlightenment, the philosophical parallels are striking. The Constitution did not create a Masonic state, but it did codify into supreme law a system of governance that reflected the values Masonic lodges had been teaching and practicing for decades. The concepts of a more perfect union, checks and balances, and the separation of church and state were not invented by the Freemasons, but they were principles that resonated deeply within the fraternity and among the many Masons who helped draft and ratify the document. Consider the preamble's goal to form a more perfect union. This language is deeply architectural, echoing the Masonic focus on building. Freemasonry teaches that each individual is a rough ashlar, an uncut stone, that must be shaped through moral education to become a perfect ashlar, ready to take its place in the symbolic temple of humanity. The Constitution frames the national project in similar terms. The Union under the Articles of Confederation was imperfect, rough, and now needed to be reshaped into a more perfect, enduring structure. The work of the convention was not to start from scratch, but to improve upon an existing foundation, much like a Masonic lodge working to improve both its members and society at large. The most obvious Masonic parallel is the system of checks and balances. In a Masonic lodge, power is not vested in a single individual. The master of the lodge governs with the consent of the brethren. He is an elected leader whose authority is checked by the lodge's bylaws and the votes of the members. The Constitution implemented this same principle on a grand scale. It deliberately distributed power among three co-equal branches of government: a Congress to make laws, a President to execute them, and a Supreme Court to interpret them. Each branch was given specific powers to check and balance the others, preventing any single person or group from becoming tyrannical. This was the political embodiment of the Masonic distrust of concentrated, unaccountable power. Another key principle was religious tolerance, which found its expression in the Constitution's prohibition of religious tests for public office, and later in the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. The Masonic Lodge was one of the few institutions in the colonial world where men of different faiths could meet as equals. This experience directly informed the framers' belief that religion was a private matter, not a prerequisite for public service. The new federal government would not have an official church, and a man's eligibility for office would depend on his merit and his commitment to the Constitution, not his creed. This was a radical departure from the European model and a direct reflection of the pluralistic environment fostered in the lodges. In the end, the U.S. Constitution is the ultimate testament to the influence of Enlightenment ideas that were circulated through fraternal networks. It is a document based on reason, skepticism of power, and a belief in the possibility of human progress. While we cannot point to a specific clause and say this is Masonic, we can look at the entire architecture of the government and see a reflection of the values that men like Washington, Franklin, and Revere held dear. The Constitution was the Grand Lodge of the American Republic, its rules and bylaws designed to create a balanced, virtuous, and lasting structure, built not for kings but for citizens. The secret principles of the lodge had become the public law of the land. 1783, the Society of the Cincinnati, an hereditary order. As the guns fell silent after the American Revolution, the officers of the Continental Army faced an uncertain future. They were returning to a nation deeply in debt and a government, the Articles of Confederation, that was too weak to pay them their long overdue wages. In this atmosphere of anxiety and neglect, a new kind of brotherhood was formed, one that would spark a fierce debate about the very soul of the new republic. In 1783, as the army encamped at Newburgh, New York, General Henry Knox conceived the idea for the Society of the Cincinnati. Named after the Roman farmer-soldier Cincinnatus, who famously left his plough to lead the Republic and then returned to his farm after victory, the society was meant to preserve the bonds of camaraderie forged in war and to provide relief to officers and their families who had fallen on hard times. But it contained one deeply controversial feature. Membership was to be hereditary, passing from the original officer to his eldest son, in perpetuity. The Society of the Cincinnati was, in many ways, a natural outgrowth of the military lodge experience. It was a fraternity of brothers in arms bound by a shared sacrifice and a common purpose. Its emblem, a golden eagle, was designed by Pierre L'Enfant, the future planner of Washington, D.C., and was rich with classical symbolism. The Society's founding documents spoke of fostering friendship and perpetuating the memory of the Revolution. For the officers, many of whom had spent 8 years of their lives in the field, it was a way to ensure that their shared struggle would not be forgotten and that they would not be abandoned by the country they had created. It was, in their eyes, a well-deserved honor and a necessary safety net. However, to many Americans, including some of the most prominent founders, The Society of the Cincinnati looked alarmingly like the beginning of a new American aristocracy. The hereditary principle was anathema to the Republican ideals for which they had just fought a war. Thomas Jefferson was its most vocal critic. He saw the society as a seedbed of hereditary nobles, and warned that it was copying the very orders of chivalry that the Revolution had sought to reject. He feared that the descendants of these officers would form a privileged class, claiming special political rights and corrupting the young democracy. In a republic founded on the principle that all men are created equal, the idea of a hereditary honor seemed a dangerous step backward toward monarchy and feudalism. The debate over the Cincinnati raged throughout the 1780s. Benjamin Franklin Riley suggested that if heredity was to be used, the honor should pass to the worthiest descendant, not merely the eldest son, perhaps even to a daughter. John Adams viewed it with deep suspicion. The public outcry forced the society to moderate its rules somewhat, but the hereditary principle remained. This controversy was a clear sign that the American experiment was fraught with tension. How could a nation balance the need to honor its heroes without creating a permanent elite? How could it celebrate military virtue without risking a military takeover of the government? The Society of the Cincinnati became the lightning rod for all these fears. In the end, the society survived, but its initial threat faded as the United States stabilized under the new Constitution. The fierce public reaction against it, however, is historically significant. It demonstrated the profound depth of the American commitment to republicanism and its visceral rejection of anything that smelled of aristocracy. The Society of the Cincinnati serves as a crucial postscript to the Revolution, a reminder that winning the war was one thing, but building a stable and egalitarian republic was another challenge entirely. It showed that the American people were fiercely vigilant, ready to challenge even their most celebrated generals at the first hint of a threat to their hard-won liberty. 1826. The Anti-Masonic Backlash. The early 19th century in America was a period of intense democratic fervor known as the Jacksonian era. It was an age that celebrated the common man and grew increasingly suspicious of any form of privilege, whether economic, political, or social. It was in this combustible atmosphere that the long-simmering fears of secret societies exploded into a full-blown political and social crusade, the anti-Masonic movement. The spark that ignited this fire was the mysterious disappearance of a man named William Morgan in Batavia, New York, in 1826. Morgan was a disgruntled former Freemason who had threatened to publish a book revealing the order's secret rituals. Before he could do so, he was arrested on a trumped-up charge, and after his release, he was abducted by a group of men never to be seen again. The Morgan affair confirmed every dark suspicion the public had about secret societies. It appeared to be a blatant case of murder committed to protect Masonic secrets. The subsequent legal proceedings were a farce. Witnesses were intimidated, and the implicated Masons, many of whom were prominent judges and businessmen, received lenient treatment. This created a perfect storm of outrage. Newspapers across New York State and then New England began a relentless campaign against Freemasonry, portraying it as a secret government that operated above the law, a conspiracy of the elite that was fundamentally incompatible with American democracy. The movement argued that Masonic oaths of loyalty to the lodge superseded oaths to the state, making it impossible for a Mason to be a trustworthy public official. This was not a minor protest. It became the first third-party movement in American history. The Anti-Masonic Party was formed, and it enjoyed significant political success in the late 1820s and early 1830s, particularly in the Northeast. They held national conventions, nominated a candidate for president in 1832, and elected numerous state legislators and members of Congress. Their platform was singular: to destroy Freemasonry by removing Masons from public office and by compelling lodges to publicly disclose their membership lists and rituals. They attacked the Society of the Cincinnati with equal fervor, seeing both as hereditary and secretive aristocracies. The movement was a powerful expression of populist anger, The tactics of the anti-Masons were as relentless as those of the societies they opposed. They used investigative journalism, passionate sermons, and mass political organizing. They held public meetings where ex-Masons would denounce the fraternity and describe its rituals, which were then printed in pamphlets and broadsides. They successfully pressured many lodges, particularly in the rural Northeast, to close their doors permanently. Freemasonry membership plummeted. The movement was so powerful that politicians were forced to publicly renounce their Masonic affiliations or see their careers destroyed. It was a cultural purge, a moment when the nation's trust in its foundational fraternities completely shattered. The anti-Masonic movement eventually faded, merging into the larger Whig Party by the 1840s. But its impact was profound. It demonstrated the raw power of populist outrage in the new American democracy. It established a lasting template for conspiracy theories in American politics, where a hidden group is blamed for society's ills. Most importantly, it forced Freemasonry and other secret societies into a defensive posture from which they would never fully recover. The hidden hands that had helped build the nation were now being forced into the light, and the public, in its zeal for transparency and equality, was willing to tear down the very networks that had once been seen as pillars of the Republic. 1828. The Freemason president, Andrew Jackson. As the anti-Masonic movement gathered force, it needed a prominent villain to focus its attacks upon. It found the perfect target in Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans and the champion of the common man. Jackson was a proud and vocal Freemason, and his rise to the presidency in 1828 became the central battleground in the culture war over secret societies. The anti-Masonic movement crystallized as a political party largely for the purpose of opposing his election. They accused him of using his Masonic connections to build a political machine, of being complicit in the cover-up of William Morgan's murder, and of representing everything that was corrupt and elitist in American politics. The irony, of course, was that Jackson's entire public persona was built on being a man of the people, fighting against the established elites of the East. Jackson never wavered in his defense of Freemasonry. He saw the attacks on the fraternity as attacks on personal liberty and freedom of association. For Jackson, a man's right to gather privately with whomever he chose was a fundamental American right. He dismissed the anti-Masons as hysterical fanatics and refused to renounce his lodge membership, even when it became a major political liability. His stance earned him the fierce loyalty of many Masons and others who saw the anti-Masonic movement as an intolerant witch hunt. The election of 1828, therefore, was not just a contest between two men, but a referendum on the place of secret societies in American life. Could a Mason be trusted with the highest office in the land? Jackson's victory was a crushing blow to the anti-Masonic party. It proved that, while the movement was powerful in certain regions, it did not have a national majority. Jackson interpreted his win as a vindication of both his policies and his principles. He proceeded to staff his administration with fellow Masons, which only fueled the conspiracy theories of his opponents. The so-called kitchen cabinet, his inner circle of informal advisors, was rumored to be a Masonic cabal secretly running the country. The fact that Jackson was a strong president who expanded executive power only made these fears seem more plausible to those who were already inclined to believe them. He became the living, breathing symbol of the tension between public power and private affiliation. The presidency of Andrew Jackson represents the peak of both Masonic influence and anti-Masonic fear. He was the last president to openly embrace the fraternity without significant public backlash for nearly a century. His battle with the anti-Masonic movement highlighted a deep ideological divide. On one side was the belief that private virtue cultivated in groups like the Masons was the bedrock of public good. On the other was the belief that any secret society was inherently corrupting and a threat to a transparent republic. Jackson's era decided this conflict for a time in favor of individual liberty and against government intrusion into private associations. But the suspicion of hidden power never truly went away. It simply found new targets, ensuring that the debate over secrecy and influence would remain a permanent feature of the American political landscape. 1789. The Tammany Society, from patriots to political machine. In the same year the Constitution was ratified, a new fraternal society was born in New York City that would come to embody the complex and often corrupt relationship between secret networks and political power. The Tammany Society, named after a legendary Native American chief, was founded in 1789 as a patriotic and nativist club. Its original purpose was to promote American values and provide an alternative to the more aristocratic societies associated with the Federalist Party. It celebrated all things American, adopting Indian titles for its leaders. Its head was called the Grand Sachem, and its members met in a hall called the Wigwam. In its early days, it was a genuine fraternity dedicated to Jeffersonian ideals of democracy and civic engagement, and it played a key role in integrating new immigrants, particularly the Irish, into the American political system. Tammany's evolution from a fraternal order to a political machine is a story of the pragmatic and often brutal world of urban politics. Its great innovation was to understand the power of the vote. As waves of immigrants arrived in New York, Tammany Hall, as its headquarters became known, positioned itself as their guardian. Party workers would meet them at the docks, help them find housing and jobs, and most importantly, help them become naturalized citizens. In return, they asked for one thing: their vote on election day. This system of patronage and loyalty was incredibly effective. It built a powerful base of support among the poor and working classes who felt ignored by the traditional political elites. Tammany provided tangible help, and in return it demanded absolute political fealty. The machinery of Tammany Hall operated like a well-oiled if shadowy corporation. At the top was a powerful boss, like William M. Tweed in the 1860s. Below him was a hierarchy of district leaders, precinct captains and block captains who knew every voter in their territory. The society itself, with its rituals and titles, provided a layer of secrecy and camaraderie that bound the organization together. Business was often conducted in private, and oaths of loyalty were implicit, if not explicit. The system was funded by kickbacks from city contracts, bribes, and extortion. It was a classic example of a secret network using its power not for revolutionary ideals, but for personal enrichment and political control, demonstrating how the tools of fraternity could be perverted into tools of corruption. For the average immigrant or poor citizen, Tammany was a paradox. It was undoubtedly corrupt, siphoning millions of dollars from the city's treasury in massive frauds. But it also provided essential social services that the city government did not. If a family's tenement burned down, a Tammany captain would provide food and shelter. If a man was arrested, a Tammany lawyer would represent him. It was a crooked but functional welfare system. This created a complex loyalty among its constituents, who often turned a blind eye to the corruption because the machine was the only institution that seemed to care about their survival. Tammany Hall proved that the power of a secret network lay not just in its secrecy, but in its ability to deliver concrete benefits to its members. The story of Tammany Hall is the dark counterpart to the revolutionary secret societies. It shows how the model of the fraternal order, brotherhood, loyalty, secrecy, and mutual aid could be stripped of its idealism and transformed into a ruthless instrument of political power. The same techniques used by the Sons of Liberty to organize a revolution were used by Tammany to rig elections and loot the public treasury. Its long and notorious history serves as a permanent warning. The hidden networks that can build a nation can also corrupt it. The power of the secret society is a tool, and like any tool, its morality depends entirely on the hands that wield it. 1819. The Independent Order of Odd Fellows. In the aftermath of the Revolution, as the nation expanded westward, the hunger for community and mutual support did not diminish. While Freemasonry catered to a more established middle class, another fraternity arose to meet the needs of the common laborer, the shopkeeper, and the farmer. the Independent Order of Odd Fellows. The IOF was founded in America in 1819 in Baltimore, having originated in England. Its name, Odd Fellows, likely came from the idea that its members were ordinary men from various trades who joined together in an odd or unusual fellowship for the purpose of helping one another and their communities. It quickly became a rival to Freemasonry, and its rapid growth throughout the 19th century tells a crucial story about the American desire for fraternity and social safety in a time of minimal government support. The core principles of the Odd Fellows were beautifully simple and directly addressed the anxieties of everyday life. Their motto was friendship, love, and truth. Unlike the more philosophical Masons, the Odd Fellows focused intensely on practical charity. Their central mission was to visit the sick, relieve the distressed, bury the dead, and educate the orphan. In an era without health insurance, unemployment benefits, or social security, the IOF Lodge provided a critical safety net. If a member fell ill, his brothers would take care of his family and his work. If he died, they would ensure his widow received a pension and his children had an education. This promise of mutual aid was a powerful draw for men building lives on the often harsh and unpredictable American frontier. The rituals and structure of the IOF were similar to those of the Masons, with degrees of initiation and symbolic regalia. This provided the same sense of mystery, belonging, and moral structure. However, their focus was less on Enlightenment philosophy and more on the practical application of biblical-style charity. They were one of the first fraternal orders to include women through the establishment of the Rebecca degree, which allowed for the creation of auxiliary branches and gave women a formal role in the order's charitable work. This inclusion broadened their reach and impact, making the IOF a true family institution in many communities, further solidifying its role as a cornerstone of civic life. The legacy of the Odd Fellows is written into the landscape of America. If you drive through any small town in the Midwest or West, you are likely to see a substantial, often three-story building labeled IOF Hall. These buildings were not just meeting places. They were community centers, housing libraries, hosting public events, and providing space for other civic groups. The IOF was a fundamental institution of civil society, a private organization that fulfilled public needs. Its success demonstrates that the impulse for fraternity, so crucial to the Revolution, remained a driving force in American life. It proved that secret societies were not just for plotting revolutions or running political machines. They were also for building the humble, essential bonds that held communities together through times of hardship and change. 1786, the Rosicrucian Echoes. While groups like the Freemasons and Odd Fellows focused on moral and civic improvement, another, more esoteric undercurrent flowed through the intellectual life of early America. This was the world of mystical philosophy, alchemy, and what we might now call speculative science, often associated with the legendary Rosicrucians. These were not organized societies with membership roles, but rather a set of ideas that fascinated some of the most brilliant minds of the founding generation, particularly Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Their interest in these arcane traditions reveals a dimension of the American Enlightenment that is often overlooked. A deep fascination with the hidden forces of nature and the universe, a desire to understand and master the world through both reason and intuition. Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity seemed to his contemporaries almost like magic. He was tapping into a fundamental, invisible force of nature. His involvement in these studies was not purely for practical application, it was part of a broader philosophical quest. Franklin was a member of the Hellfire Club in England and was deeply interested in the works of earlier alchemists and mystics. Alchemy was not merely about turning lead into gold. It was a spiritual and philosophical discipline concerned with transformation and the search for a fundamental primal matter. Franklin's approach to science contained this element of wonder and the belief that by uncovering nature's secrets, man could achieve a kind of mastery and perfection, both over the physical world and over himself. Thomas Jefferson, the arch-rationalist, also had his mystical side. He was a devoted student of the earth mysteries of his day. He owned and annotated books on the lost continent of Atlantis, and believed that the Native American mounds found across the continent were evidence of a sophisticated lost civilization. He was fascinated by cosmology and the idea of a universal law that governed everything from physics to morality. While he rejected the superstitions of organized religion, he was open to esoteric ideas that proposed a rational, yet hidden, order to the universe. His deism was not cold and mechanical. It was filled with a sense of awe for the complex design of the great architect. These Rosicrucian echoes remind us that the Founding Fathers were men of their time, and the 18th century was a period where the lines between science, philosophy, and mysticism were often blurred. The pursuit of light in the Masonic sense could mean both the light of reason and an inner, spiritual illumination. This mystical strand of thought did not directly influence the structure of the government, but it did contribute to the intellectual climate. It fostered a mindset that was open to radical transformation, that believed the world could be remade according to higher principles. The same intellectual curiosity that led Jefferson to design a plow also led him to ponder lost civilizations. This combination of hard-headed pragmatism and boundless philosophical speculation was a unique and powerful engine that helped drive the American experiment. 1694. The Society of the Woman in the Wilderness. Long before the Revolution, the American colonies were a refuge for religious groups seeking freedom from persecution in Europe. Among the most fascinating and obscure were the German pietist communities that settled in Pennsylvania, the colony founded by the Quaker William Penn on the principle of religious tolerance. One of the first of these groups was the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness, established near Philadelphia in 1694. Led by a mystic named Johannes Kelpius, this small community of scholars and devout believers came to America awaiting the imminent end of the world. They practiced a life of extreme asceticism, celibacy, and devoted themselves to prayer, astrology, alchemy, and the study of the esoteric Kabbalah. The community's very name reveals its mystical worldview. The woman in the wilderness is a reference from the Book of Revelation, chapter 12, symbolizing a pure church fleeing into the wilderness to be protected from persecution. Kelpius and his followers believed they were that church, preparing for the second coming of Christ in the untamed forests of America. They built a large log cabin that served as both a monastery and an astronomical observatory on a ridge outside Philadelphia, which became known as the Tabernacle. From this vantage point, they scanned the skies for signs and portents, believing their devotion would help usher in a new millennial age. They were the American precursors to the more famous Shakers and Rappites. The significance of the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness lies not in its longevity. It disbanded after Kelpius's death in 1708, but in what it represents. It was part of a wave of radical religious experimentation that made colonial Pennsylvania, and particularly the area around Philadelphia, a unique laboratory of faith and thought. These communities contributed to the colony's reputation as a place where unorthodox ideas could flourish safe from the reach of state churches. This environment of religious pluralism and free inquiry was the essential precondition for the political and philosophical innovations that would follow. The mystical seeking of Kelpius and his brethren helped to create a culture where new ideas, no matter how strange, could be tested. The echoes of this mystical tradition can be faintly heard in the founding generation. While the framers were largely deists and rationalists, the atmosphere of religious experimentation that groups like Kelpius's helped create was part of the air they breathed. It fostered a spirit of independence and a willingness to challenge authority, whether that authority was a king or a church bishop. The story of the Society of the Woman in the Wilderness is a reminder that the quest for liberty in America had deep spiritual roots. Before there was a political revolution, there was a revolution of the spirit, a search for a new Zion in the wilderness, a search that helped make the colonies fertile ground for the seeds of enlightenment, reason that would later blossom into independence. 1776. The Tories' secret networks. The narrative of the American Revolution is overwhelmingly told from the perspective of the victorious patriots. But secrecy was a tool wielded by both sides. An estimated 15 to 20% of the colonial population remained loyal to the British Crown, and they too organized secret societies and intelligence networks to counter the rebellion. These loyalists, or Tories, faced intimidation, violence, and confiscation of their property. To survive and support the British cause, they were forced to operate in the shadows, creating a mirror image of the patriot secret world. Their story is a crucial reminder that the revolution was also a civil war, pitting neighbor against neighbor, and that the battle of hidden networks was a two-way street. The most effective loyalist secret society was the Associated Loyalists, founded in New York in 1779 by William Franklin, the last royal governor of New Jersey, and in a poignant twist, the son of Benjamin Franklin. This organization conducted guerrilla warfare against patriot communities along the coast of New York and New Jersey, launching raids not unlike those of the Sons of Liberty. They gathered intelligence on patriot troop movements and passed it to British commanders. In the South, loyalist militias like David Fanning's band in the Carolinas used secrecy and surprise to terrorize patriot settlements. For these men, the secret network was not a vehicle for liberty, but for restoring order and maintaining their allegiance to the king. Loyalist intelligence rings operated within patriot-held territory. In Philadelphia, while the British occupied the city, a sophisticated spy ring known as the Mischianza operated. When the patriots retook the city, loyalists who remained behind continued to gather information. They used invisible ink, coded messages, and secret couriers to communicate with British headquarters in New York. The Culper spy ring, made famous by patriot exploits, had its loyalist equivalents whose stories are less celebrated but were equally active. This shadow war of espionage was critical. The side with the better intelligence often won the battle. The British failure was not for lack of trying, but often due to the Patriots' more deeply embedded local networks. The fate of the Loyalists after the war was tragic. Approximately 60,000 of them were forced into exile, fleeing to Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean. Their property was seized, and they became refugees in the empire they had tried to save. Their story complicates the clean narrative of a united people rising up against tyranny. It shows that the revolution was a bitter, divisive conflict, where the line between patriot and traitor depended entirely on which side you were on. The secret networks of the Tories ultimately failed, but their existence is a vital part of the historical record. They prove that the methods of the secret society, the oaths, the clandestine meetings, the covert actions, were not inherently revolutionary. They were simply a form of power, available to anyone with a cause to advance and a need to hide their work. 1775, African-American Fraternal Orders. In the same year that the first shots of the revolution were fired, another quieter revolution in self-organization was taking place within the free black community of Boston. As we have seen, Prince Hall and 14 other free black men were initiated into a British military lodge. But their story did not end there. After the war, these men, now seasoned Masons, found themselves excluded from the white Masonic lodges of the new United States. Undeterred, Prince Hall petitioned the Grand Lodge of England and received a charter in 1784 establishing African Lodge number 459. This was the birth of Prince Hall Freemasonry, the first continuously existing African-American institution in the United States, and a powerful force for community building, mutual aid, and the pursuit of civil rights. For free black men in the early republic, the Masonic Lodge provided something that was denied to them in the larger society: dignity, respect, and a platform for leadership. Inside their lodge, they were not second-class citizens. They were worshipful masters, treasurers, and secretaries. They practiced self-governance and debated ideas of morality and philosophy. The lodge became a training ground for a black leadership class. Prince Hall himself used his position to advocate for abolition and for the rights of black people. In 1777, he petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for the abolition of slavery, and in 1788, he spoke out against the kidnapping of free black men into slavery. The lodge was not just a social club, it was a base for political action. The principles of Freemasonry, brotherly love, relief, and truth, took on a profound and specific meaning for African Americans. Relief meant creating mutual aid societies to care for widows, orphans, and the sick within their community, which was often ignored by white institutions. Truth meant fighting for the truth that all men are created equal, a truth the nation had proclaimed but failed to live up to. Prince Hall Masonry spread from Boston to other cities, becoming a national network that connected black leaders across state lines. It provided the organizational structure for the early Black Convention movement and for the creation of schools and other vital community resources. The establishment and endurance of Prince Hall Freemasonry is one of the most powerful legacies of the secret society in America. It demonstrates that the ideals of the Enlightenment and the fraternal form were so powerful that they could be adopted and adapted by those who were formerly excluded from their benefits. While white lodges often upheld the racial prejudices of the day, Black Masons held fast to the universalist core of the doctrine, using it to build their own temples of liberty and equality. They took the tools of the secret society and used them to chip away at the foundations of oppression, proving that the quest for light was not the exclusive property of any one race, but the birthright of all humanity. 1787. The Double-Edged Sword of Secrecy. As we have journeyed through the hidden history of America's founding, a complex picture has emerged. Secret societies were not a monolithic force for good or evil. They were a double-edged sword, a tool that could be used to build a nation or to corrupt it. On one hand, secrecy provided a safe space for free thought and dissent, a sanctuary where revolutionary ideas could germinate away from the watchful eyes of authority. It built bonds of trust that transcended regional and class differences, creating the personal networks without which the revolution could never have been organized. The lodge room was a laboratory for democracy, where men practiced self-governance and learned to see each other as equals. In a world without free speech or political parties, these private associations were essential for civic development. On the other hand, the very nature of secrecy carried inherent dangers. By their design, these societies were exclusive. They created in-groups and out-groups, fostering a sense of elitism and privilege among their members. This exclusion could, and did, lead to corruption. The closed doors of Tammany Hall allowed for backroom deals that robbed the public treasury. The secrecy of the Freemasons, when combined with the Morgan affair, fueled public paranoia and a legitimate suspicion that justice was being perverted. Secrecy can be a shield for the virtuous, but it can also be a cloak for the villainous. The power that comes from hidden knowledge and private loyalties is always susceptible to abuse, threatening the transparent accountability that a healthy republic requires. This tension is built into the very fabric of the United States. The Constitution was created in secret, yet it established a government whose operations are, in principle, open to public scrutiny. The First Amendment protects the right to freedom of association, allowing for private groups to exist, but the history of the anti-Masonic movement shows that the public will demand transparency from those who seek public office. The American experiment has been a continuous balancing act between the need for private space where innovation and fellowship can flourish and the demand for public accountability to prevent the rise of a hidden oligarchy. This is not a problem that was solved in the 18th century. It is a dynamic tension that continues to define American democracy today. The lesson from the founding era is that secrecy is a powerful technology, but it is not an ideology. Its moral value depends entirely on the ends to which it is applied. The Sons of Liberty used secrecy to fight tyranny. The Tories used it to uphold what they saw as legitimate authority. The Freemasons used it to promote enlightenment. Their critics saw it as a source of dark corruption. There is no simple verdict. To understand the role of these societies is to accept this ambiguity. They were not angels or demons. They were men, gathering in the half-light. their actions shaping a nation in ways both visible and invisible, for better and for worse. Their story teaches us to be wary of hidden power, but also to appreciate the quiet spaces where new and dangerous ideas for a better world can first be whispered. The hidden fabric of a nation? So what are we to make of all this? The birth of the United States was not a simple, linear event, but a complex tapestry woven with many different threads. There were the public threads, the declarations, the battles, the great documents, that we can all see and celebrate. But running through and between these public acts were the hidden threads, the secret oaths, the private meetings, the fraternal handshakes, and the confidential letters. These hidden threads formed a strong, resilient fabric that gave structure and strength to the whole creation. The story of America's founding is incomplete without an understanding of this hidden dimension. The public face of the revolution was supported by a private skeleton of trust, ideology, and organization. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is a historical reality. The men who founded America were not isolated individuals. They were connected to one another through a web of affiliations that shaped their thinking and enabled their actions. The Masonic Lodge taught them the practice of equality and reasoned debate. The Sons of Liberty taught them the tactics of resistance and the power of popular mobilization. The Committees of Correspondence taught them how to build a national consciousness. These were the schools of revolution, the networks that turned a scattered opposition into a coordinated force. The Founding Fathers were the products of these networks, and the nation they built reflects the values and the methods they learned within them. The legacy of these societies is not a hidden cabal controlling America from a shadowy room. Their true legacy is woven into the public fabric of the nation's ideals and institutions. You can see it in the checks and balances of the Constitution, which mirror the distributed power of a lodge. You can see it in the separation of church and state, a principle practiced in lodges long before it was codified in law. You can see it in the enduring American belief in self-improvement, community service, and the power of voluntary association to solve public problems. The hidden hands of the 18th century built a nation that, for all its flaws, remains a monument to their ideals of liberty, equality, and the relentless pursuit of a more perfect union. As we look back, we see that the American experiment was just that, an experiment. It was a gamble on the idea that people could govern themselves. The secret societies of the founding era were the laboratories where that experiment was first tested. They provided the safe space, the intellectual framework, and the social glue that made the gamble possible. They remind us that nations are not built by statues alone, but by the countless, often unseen actions of individuals bound together by a shared purpose. The next time you look at a dollar bill and see the all-seeing eye or read the words of the Declaration, remember the quiet meetings, the solemn oaths, and the brotherhoods in the shadows. For the hidden fabric of the nation is all around us, if we only know where to look. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. See you in the next video.